and IEEE SPS MBIT student branch and MBIT family enthusiastically welcome our honorable speaker for the day, Dr. Vineet N. Balasubramanian, our diligent faculty members, and all the fellow participants. Now I would like to invite Dr. Chirag Poonawalla, Chair of Technical Activities, IEEE SPS Gujarat section, who would brief us about the activities carried out under IEEE SPS Gujarat section.
Thank you, Dhruva, and thanks to our dignitary of day, Professor Vinit, and I am also welcoming Professor Rajesh from Kerala chapter, and thankful to him to collaborate our event, to collaborate with us for this particular event, and enlight the uh, actually we can say the scholars of Kerala also with the Gujarat, and this second hands will be there in future also. So, in brief, as a chapter chair of IEEE SPS chapter Gujarat section, it is really proud for me to share the contents that what we are doing in Gujarat for SPS members. So let's. I think my presentation is visible to you.
Sir, it is visible.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going on the next slide. Yeah, so this is our executive committee for the 2021, and based on this executive committee, we have dedicated chairs for all the activities. Right now, Arpan is looking after the technical activity, and he is organizing talk every month, and he is inviting dedicated speaker for all the scholars of SPS. Similarly, we have student and YP chair. We have chair for the women in signal processing. For professional activity, also we have dedicated chair, and we try to have a balancing between the male and female ratio. That is what the IEEE is interested. So we have balance, perfect balancing in our executive committee related to the male and the female members. Now I am just narrating activities of IEEE SPS chapter Gujarat section in brief. So basically, the main activity is supported by IEEE SPS USA is a distinguished lecturer program and distinguished industry speaker program. So we are organizing this activity at least in a month for our members. We have dedicated a flagship event that is known as the New Trends in Signal Processing, and in recent March, just we had a fourth edition of this particular event at DAIICT Gandhinagar. Recently, we had started in the 2021 itself. We had started that technical talk series, and as I have narrated, that Arpan is looking after this particular technical talk series, and we are inviting the eminent personalities in the field of signal processing for this particular talk series. We have also started Women in Signal Processing Wing under SPS chapter Gujarat section, and the aim is over here to promote and increase the visibility and recognition of women in particularly signal processing fields. We are promoting the YP activities, means young professional activities. And recently we did one program for the YP members, that how to write a technical paper and how to fetch a grant for the particular YP members. So these are some glimpses of the distinguished lecture on the distinguished industry speakers. So at least in a year, we are planning to have 5 to 6 DL and DIS talks in this chapter. And right now we are working in the virtual mode. So at least we are planning that 1 to 2 talks per month, so that our members will get benefited from the distinguished speaker of our society. And as I have noted, New Trends in Signal Processing is one of the pioneer event or the flagship event. And we have it's a biannual event. And this year also we had organized it virtually, and it is getting tremendous response among researchers all over the India. In the technical talk series aspect, as mentioned that this is the month of May, and we have already invited 6 speakers till date, and all the speakers, as you can see, that all are the eminent speakers in their respective fields. So all the participants are enjoying the things that we are sharing, particularly in the technical talk series aspect. In the women in signal processing also, we had 2 speakers. Right now, we had invited 2 speakers. One was Professor Namrata Vaswani. Another one was Miss Swati Maharshi, and she is actually executive editor in the Springer. Recently, as I have narrated, we had a young professional activity and we have one panel discussion. And that panel discussion is related to how to motivate young professionals towards the research. And this program was also very successful. Now, related to SPS membership, for student members, it is just $1. And we are aware that we have feature 50 code, which is still enable, and student member can get 50% discount based on this code also. And for professional member, it is just $11 as we are applying the feature 50 code also. So it's $11 for our professional members. Now, some of the highlighted offers for SPS members that our chapter is also supporting, as well as IEEE SPS USA is also supporting. So our chapter is supporting the grant of paper publication, and that grant is open for both the students as well as the professional members. So every year we are selecting some applications, and we are giving grant for the paper publication to them. We are also supporting travel grants for the major SPS conference like ICAST and the ICIP to the student members. And it is per student member we are dedicating this grant. And the best paper award for journal by chapter, and that is this year onwards we have planned to start this particular activity. Discount in registration fees during any event that is supported by chapter, and the priority when seats are limited during some of the prestigious events. As well as we are planning to have a PhD forum as well as UG/PG dissertation competition. So these are some of the key things that we can have, or our students or our members can have from the SPS chapter Gujarat section. Some of the SPS student programs are supported by IEEE SPS USA also, like a student career luncheon in the ICAS and the ICIP also, in which the Google or Apple or the Amazon are also the participants. Student competitions are there in the ICAS and ICIP, and our chapter is promoting these events in our for our members also. Hackathon we have started this year onwards for our members, and still we want to organize it for the national level, and we will take help of eminent speakers like Professor Vinit for planning this hackathon for our uh, for entire India level. Some awards and recognition based on our activities that we are doing since 2014. So our chapter got the best chapter award in 2015 and 2016, consecutively 2 years. And that is the history in the IEEE SPS, that any one chapter is fetching this award consecutively 2 years. And meritorious regional chapter service award that was also with us, that first award. So, and we are also right now certified chapter. So we are receiving the chapter certification award also, and it is valid till 2022. So these are the award and recognition from IEEE SPS USA to the Gujarat chapter. We have our own newsletter, and that newsletter already we had one edition, and that edition you can find out from our Gujarat section website, as well as we can keep it right now in the chat window also. So you can go through that newsletter, and that newsletter consists of the technical articles also, as well as the development in the chapter as well as in the society both. So with this small presentation, I am thanking you all, and now handing over to the Sir, Vinit sir.
Sure. Can you see me and hear me?
Yeah, sir.
Okay, great, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for hosting me today, and thank you for sharing these achievements and efforts of the IEEE Signal Processing Society chapter of Gujarat. I think it's very nice to see all these efforts going on there. Thank you again for having me today. So maybe let me just share my screen and I
Vinit,
can
sir.
get. Yes, please.
Just a second, we would like to introduce you. So,
Yeah, sir. First of all, you would introduce you all.
Sure.
just a second. Okay. Thank you so much, sir. Moving further, I would like to call upon Ms. Preeti Nanda, the chairperson of IEEE MBIT SPS Society, to introduce our audience to the expert for the day, Dr. Vineet N. Balasubramanian.
Thank you, Dhruva. Dr. Vineet N. Balasubramanian is an associate professor in the Department of Computer Science and Engineering at the Indian Institute of Technology, Hyderabad, India, and currently serves as the head of the Department of Artificial Intelligence at IIT Hyderabad. His research interests include deep learning, machine learning, and computer vision. His research has resulted in over 100 peer-reviewed publications at various international venues, including top-tier venues such as ICML, CVPR, NeurIPS, ICCV, KDD, ICDM, and IEEE TPAMI. His PhD dissertation at Arizona State University on the conformal prediction framework was nominated for the outstanding PhD dissertation at the Department of Computer Science. He serves as a senior PC area chair for conferences such as CVPR, ICCV, AAAI, IJCAI, and is an associate editor for the Patent Recognition Journal with recent awards as Outstanding Reviewer at ICLR 2021, CVPR 2019, ECCV 2020, etc. He is also a recipient of the Teaching Excellence Award at IIT Hyderabad in 2017 and a Google Research Scholar Award, earlier known as Google Research Faculty Award, in 2020. His research is funded by various organizations, including DST, DRDO, Microsoft Research, Google Research, Adobe, Intel, KLA, and Honeywell. He currently serves as the secretary of the AAAI India chapter.
Okay. Thank you, Reeti. We are honored to have such an esteemed guest as our speaker. Now we would ask Sir to commence the session further.
Yes, thank you, Dhruva. Thank you, Reeti, and thank you to Arpan for coordinating this session and having me here again today. Thank you for the kind introduction also. Let me share my screen and we can get started. Maybe you can tell me if you can see my screen. Is my
Yes,
screen?
sir. Yes, sir. It is visible.
Okay, wonderful, great. All right. Okay, so the title for my talk today is Deep Learning with Limited Label Data, Recent Trends and Challenges. And you'll probably get a sense of what this topic is about as we go forward. I know this is a signal processing society, but these days I think the line between machine learning and signal processing has been blurring. So I hope that this talk would be of relevance to most of you, right? So, and maybe one logistics thing that I wanted to mention is please do feel free to interject, ask questions at any time. I may not be able to follow the chat when I'm seeing my slides. So I'm completely fine if you want to unmute and speak. If I'm not sure if the permissions are allowed, but if you have a question to ask, please do feel free to unmute and ask. I'd love this to be as interactive and as useful as possible. Stop me at any time that you think is needed. And just a time check before I start. I know we're at 11:20. I know probably I delayed the start by a few minutes. I'm sorry about that. But what's the time limit that we can go for? I'll accordingly pace my talk.
Sir, it is fine. I
Sir,
mean, you
yeah,
can go ahead. We
yeah,
have
sir.
planned for 1 hour, and that should be okay with us.
So we are interested in your talk, so please go ahead.
Sure, yeah. Maybe I'll try to keep it about 45 to 50 minutes, so then there's time at the end for questions and this open discussion. Maybe that may be more purposeful. Okay, great. Let's actually get started. Maybe I'll just start by sharing a little bit about what we do in our group here at IIT Hyderabad. We broadly work in the areas of deep learning, machine learning, and computer vision. Those are the main research areas that we work on. And we work both on algorithmic contributions in this area, as well as doing applied research in this area. From an algorithmic or a fundamental perspective, some of the problems that we look at is a theory of deep learning. I think trying to understand why does deep learning work? I think that's still not very well understood at this time. There are a lot of open questions as to why do deep neural networks work so well. Right? So that's definitely one of the directions that we work on. Some of the example papers that we have here is trying to understand loss surfaces of deep neural networks. That was one of our recent works. Trying to use submodularity in batch selection for training deep neural networks faster, or trying to understand the connection between, say, noise and optimality of the solution when you train deep neural networks. This is some of the directions that we've been working on over the last few years. A second direction that we have quite a few efforts going on is in the direction of explainability in explainable deep learning and machine learning. So there are multiple perspectives we look at here. One of the directions where we have been active for quite a while now is causality in deep neural networks. I think we all perhaps know that machine learning learns from both correlations and causations. For example, if you have, just a minute, it's requesting to annotate, okay. Oh, great, thank you. I think it, I assume it gives me the option to annotate. Just give me one moment. Okay, yeah, so thank you. I think that's helpful. So close this. Okay. So if you take, say, hospital data, right? So let's say you want to predict the risk of a heart disease for a patient or something like that, right? So we all probably know that an elevated blood pressure is correlated with, say, a prediction of a heart attack or something like that. But that doesn't mean an elevated blood pressure causes a heart attack, right? So if you give it to a machine learning model, the machine learning model is going to relate the fact that a high blood pressure directly correlates to a high heart attack, and may say that whenever somebody has a high blood pressure, the risk of a heart attack is high, right? But this is not a causal perspective, right? So how do you bring causal perspectives into machine learning models and deep learning models in particular is something that we've been looking at. There are several directions here, but we have some published work in the context of explainability of neural networks from a causal angle. More recently, we've also been looking at the intersection of explainability and adversarial robustness, looking at problems in attributional robustness, so on and so forth. So we also look at how do you explain what are called visual explanations. How do you explain why a convolutional neural network predicts an image of a cat as a cat? Right? So things of those kinds are also other things that we work on in the explainability space. The focus of today's talk is perhaps going to be this third dimension, which is just a minute. I probably need to. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so is learning with limited supervision is how do you learn when you have very limited label data? So I'll probably skip what I have to say here in the interest of time because I'm going to describe that in detail over the next 45 minutes or so. From an applied perspective, some of the problems we work on is security and surveillance, agriculture, autonomous navigation, aerospace. We've been doing some work in all of these areas using deep learning for agriculture. We have some work going on with DRDO and using deep learning for security and surveillance, trying to use deep learning for autonomous navigation in India, which is people say is the grandmother of all AI problems, to make a self-driving car in the Indian context. Then we also have some work in aerospace and human behavior understanding, so on and so forth. And we are grateful to several organizations that have kindly supported our research, both the government, defense organizations, as well as multiple organizations in the industry that fund our research. Okay, so with that brief introduction to what we do, let me actually go on to the topic for today's talk, which is learning with limited data. So what I'll try to do over the next 45 minutes or so is to give you an introduction as to why this problem is important today, talk about a couple of our recent efforts in detail, and maybe the rest of our efforts as an overview. So hopefully my hope is that you'll get a broad perspective of different things that we do and different things that are happening today in the world, but probably a deeper perspective on a couple of these threads at least, so you get a better sense of what is happening here. Okay, so that's what we'll try to do over the next 45 minutes. So if you've followed machine learning, the success of machine learning has been in the supervised machine learning setting, where if you have large amounts of label data, you can learn models that you can apply to real world problems, right? So we know now that if you have a large amount of label data, it becomes a problem of engineering, right? It's still difficult, but we know that playing around with hyperparameters, playing around with a few learning strategies, you can make models work and deploy them in the real world. That's what the last 10 years have actually taught us. They've taught us that if you have large amounts of label data, you can actually deploy some of these systems in the real world. Unfortunately, not all paradigms of machine learning are related to supervised machine learning, right? So you all may have, you all perhaps know that machine learning paradigms are broadly divided into a few different kinds. Supervised learning is where you have label data. Unsupervised learning is where you have only data but no labels. And then of course you have other paradigms like reinforcement learning, which use the concept of a delayed reward. So Jan LeCun, who's one of the founding forefathers of deep learning, who also won a Turing Award for deep learning a couple of years ago, had an interesting analogy to these paradigms of learning. Right? So he said that supervised machine learning is like the frosting on a cake, right? So that's the icing on the cake that you see, the pink layer that you see on this particular image. Reinforcement learning is like the cherry on the cake. So these are all, I mean, that's what makes these things very interesting, very impressive. But unsupervised learning is actually the cake. That's the one we are yet to bake, right? For the last couple of decades, we have been focusing on getting the frosting right, getting the cherry. In the last couple of years at least, reinforcement learning has been extremely popular, but unsupervised learning is the cake that we really need to bake, right? Why is this important? Maybe I'll complete this story and talk about that. But what I add to this is that it's not just about frosting on a cake. There are several layers of the cake there. It's not just going from supervised learning from unsupervised learning. There are several gradations in the middle which talk about learning with limited supervision, right? So, and we'll see some of these settings as we go forward. But why is this important practically speaking, right? So if you actually see maybe any of you who does research and publishes your work, or probably even me, right? So I'm paid by the Indian government. I mean, so we probably, many of us are probably doing academic research or basic research from that perspective, right? But all the data sets that we work on are data sets that have been released by some industry partner somewhere in the world, right? Maybe a Google, maybe a Facebook, maybe an Amazon, so on and so forth, has released a data set, publicly available data set, and that's what we often work on. This is sad because we ideally want to solve local problems, right? The only way to solve local problems is to have data sets that are local, right? You want to have a data set that's from your nearby hospital, from your farmer in a village that you come from, right? So these are probably the kind of problems that we really want to solve. But unfortunately, we cannot solve it because there are not data sets. There are no large labeled data sets available to solve these problems. Okay, so maybe one of you takes the effort to collect such a data set, but there are multiple problems. The data set is going to be small. The labels may be noisy. You may want to combine this with some other data set that has a different perspective. You may have some classes with lots of instances, some classes with very few instances, and all of these constitute problems of learning with limited supervision, right? So we need to be able to solve these problems to actually take machine learning to the next billion people, right? So the billion people that anyway access the internet, Facebook, WhatsApp, and so on, there are existing large-scale data sets that can solve those problems. If we want to take machine learning to the next billion, the third billion, so on and so forth, these are probably people that are in remote areas, and you're not going to get very strong data sets from these kinds of people. Right? So how do you solve problems when your data is limited is the fundamental question that we want to try to ask over the rest of today's talk. An obvious answer to this is collect data sets, right? So obviously we could say the Indian government, the state government, maybe NGOs, maybe some of us should collect data sets and make them public so that researchers can benefit and solve these problems. But then this is not easy. This is one angle of solving it, but we also need the other angle of solving it where we say even if limited data is being given to a machine learning researcher, they can probably try to solve these problems with that limited data. Okay, that's the angle that we want to look at over the rest of this talk. Okay, let's now try to see what does learning with limited supervision really mean. Just a minute, I'm just going to move some of this. Just give me one moment. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So let's look at standard supervised learning here, right? Standard supervised learning is where you have a task T1, where your data X and Y come from some distribution D1. You have a learner, some machine learning algorithm, you learn a model, and then you deploy that model on some data that comes from the same distribution D1. Okay, that's what you have in the standard supervised learning setting. Now let's try to talk about the other kinds of settings that come here. You have multitask learning, where your data could now come from multiple tasks. An example could be you have face data, but you now want to do face recognition on that data, you want to do expression recognition on that data, you want to do head pose estimation on that data, you want to do say age estimation of that person on that face image. So you're trying to solve multiple tasks on the same data. This is typically called multitask learning, where you have tasks T1 to Tn, data coming from distributions D1 to Dn. Then you train a machine learning model such that that single machine learning model can then be deployed to help solve problems on all of these tasks at the same time. Right? So that's one setting for such a paradigm of learning with limited supervision. Then comes transfer learning and domain adaptation, right? So I did see that one of the earlier technical talks was in this topic. So in transfer learning and domain adaptation is where you want to take some knowledge from some other domain and apply it to a different domain. Again, the goal is to solve problems in a target domain where there is limited knowledge, right? So that's the premise here. So you have a source task TS, a target task TT, then you have data coming from a distribution DS in the source task, data coming from a distribution DT in the target task. You have a model that you've learned on the source task. You have a model that you're learning on the target task. You want to see what knowledge can you leverage from the model that you learned on the source task and apply it on the target task, right? So today, if you're doing deep learning, doing something like fine tuning is very, very common, right? So that's effectively a transfer learning approach, right? So where you're trying to take a pre-trained model from a different domain and then fine tune it and solve a task in a target domain. So this is effectively a transfer learning setting. Then you have domain adaptation, where you necessarily need not have a learned model on the source domain. You may just want to use the data from the source domain in some way to be able to help improve performance in the target domain. So that's what domain adaptation is about, right? So one thing I do want to prefix this discussion is to say that some of these keywords are probably defined in different ways by different people around the world, but this is one way of defining these settings which is at least accepted to a certain extent. So then we go on to what is called K-short learning. In K-short learning, what you have now is you have a total set of n classes, of which m less than n are scene classes. The remaining c plus cm plus 1 to n classes, you have only k samples, right? You have all the samples from some of the classes, but you have only a few samples from some of the other classes, right? So for example, it's possible that there's a rare form of cancer, and for that you're only going to get few samples. For perhaps people without cancer or people with other forms of cancer, you may get a lot of samples, right? So then you still have to train a model which should be able to perform well on all your classes. This is typically called K-short learning. If K is very few in number, you call few-shot learning. If K is only 1 in number, then you call that one-shot learning. If K is 0, you call it zero-shot learning. Right? So today you can also learn if you have absolutely no samples from some of these classes, but you can still come up with a model that can actually classify data from those classes. Then you have continual learning, which is a pretty hot topic today. Continual learning, lifelong learning, incremental learning. Those are all synonymous here. That's another setting where you have a task that comes from a certain distribution. Then tomorrow you have a different task that where the distribution is suddenly changed. And over time, you have to probably solve many of these tasks where the distribution is continuously changing, right? But you want to learn a model that can continue to work in all of these settings over time. Right? So which means, let's say you're trying to classify animals. Today I have data that comes from say cat, lion, tiger, and say buffalo. I train a model and it works on these 4 classes. Then tomorrow I get 4 more new classes, right? Let's say I get an elephant, giraffe, an ostrich, and say a crocodile, right? So I get data from these 4 classes, but I've already lost the data for my past 4 classes that I had because of say a data buffer problem. I don't have enough memory. I didn't know when the next classes would come. For whatever reason, maybe I'll have newer classes that come in. The distribution has changed, but I now have to train a model that can classify all these 8 animals effectively. So the typical problem that people talk about here is called the problem of catastrophic forgetting, where when you try to learn a model on the second task, which has say 4 classes, you forget how to classify on the first task, which had 4 classes. Okay, this is called the problem of catastrophic forgetting. And addressing catastrophic forgetting is the main objective of methods that are proposed for continual learning. Finally, more recently, there's been a setting called domain generalization that's been pretty popular. Domain generalization is where you train a model given a few source domains. For example, you have TS and TT to be a couple of domains here where you have data distributions. You train a model and your goal is to make this model work on an unseen domain. An example could be a couple of examples that people use is, let's say you're trying to develop an autonomous navigation vehicle. So you may train your data on data that you capture in broad daylight, right? So you all may have heard about Google Street View, so on and so forth. Say Google sends out a car and that car keeps going around the daytime in different cities in the world. And based on that, maybe you get some data and you solve a problem. Now, similarly, let's say Google goes around whenever there's rain and captures more data and now knows how to solve the problem when say the weather is raining. Now, the question is, with these 2 kinds of data, can you now make the car go when it's nighttime? So these are 3 different domains of data from a distribution perspective. So you have data captured in daylight, you have data captured in rainy weather, but now you want the model to work in the night. Right? So how do you make it happen is what domain generalization is about. Another example is, let's say you classify a cat image, you classify a cat clip art, and now you want to now be able to classify a cat painting, right? So that's a different domain of a data. The distribution is different, but you still want your model to work on all of this data. That's what domain generalization is about. Okay, hopefully that gave you a perspective of these different settings here. Any questions so far? Maybe before I move forward, any questions on what I talked about so far? Okay, all right. No questions. Let's.
No, there is no question right now, sir.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Let's move on. So what I'll do now is probably go a little bit into depth of a couple of recent papers that we have. Maybe it gives you a flavor of more recent research and going into the depth. And then later in the talk, I'll try to skim over many other things that we do at a high level, so it gives you a broader perspective also. Okay. So the first book that I'm going to talk about is called Zero Shot Task Transfer. This is joint work with a PhD student of mine, Arya, and this work was presented at CVPR as an oral paper. So the motivation for this work is when we talk about understanding images, right? So often with the same image, there are many tasks that we perform. We can do surface normal estimation. We can compute Euclidean distance of an object from a camera viewpoint. You can solve a jigsaw puzzle on an image. You can colorize an image. You can do segmentation of the image. You can detect vanishing points in an image. You can do 2D edges, 3D edge detection. You can do so many other things with a single image. Right? So what we want to ask now is, if we had, say, about K vision tasks to accomplish, say, tau 1 to tau K, let's call them, say, you want to do object recognition, depth estimation, edge detection, pose estimation, etc., right? So how do you automatically predict model parameters for tasks without any ground truth? Why do we need this? So today, if you see, there are data sets for surface normal estimation, there are data sets for image classification, there are data sets for semantic segmentation. Effectively, all of them are different tasks on similar kinds of images, right? So, and why do we have different data sets? Because different groups of people are trying to solve different problems, and whenever they want to solve a problem, they come up with a data set for that problem, right? But you could now ask the question, why don't we come up with a single data set that can solve all of these tasks, right? Effectively, the images are the same. Why should we say that there should be a separate data set for image classification, a separate data set for depth estimation, a separate data set for pose estimation, so on and so forth, right? So why don't we leverage the relationships between the tasks that we're trying to solve on a single image anyway? Because that's the perspective that we had in trying to address this problem. So what we assume here is that for among k tasks that we consider, for m of those tasks where m is less than k, we are going to call them known tasks, right? So which means that we have the data and the labels given for these tasks. And for the remaining m plus 1 to k tasks, we call them zero shot tasks, which means we have absolutely no ground truth for that data, right? No labeled information, no label information for the remaining tasks m plus 1 to k. Okay, this is the setting in which we're going to operate. So the way we go about it is to envision model parameters on what we call a meta manifold. Right? So we're going to assume for these known tasks, tau 1 to tau m, because it's known task, which means we have the data, we have the labels, which means you can train the models in a fully supervised manner. You can learn model parameters. So we assume now that each of these model parameters, they lie as a vector in some dimensional space, right? We're going to call this a meta manifold, right? So it's, why is it a meta manifold? It's a manifold of model parameters. It's not the manifold of data. It's the manifold of model parameters, the weights of a neural network, right? So let's say you're trying to solve Euclidean distance estimation of an object in a given image. You train a supervised model on it. Then the model parameters that you get for that trained model is going to be a point in some dimensional space. If you had 1,000,000 parameters, then this is a point in 1,000,000 dimensional space. Similarly, a second task could be another point in the 1,000,000 dimensional space, and the mth task among the m tasks that we have, let's say that's the semantic segmentation task. You learn a model for it, and that model is going to be another point in this dimensional space. Right? So that's what you have. That's what you have here. So obviously, this is not possible for a zero-shot task because you don't have label data. So which means you cannot train a model in a supervised manner. So you don't know where those parameters lie in this meta manifold. So what we try to say is that for the unknown zero-shot parameters, we know that those model parameters also will lie somewhere in this meta manifold. Right? So somewhere in this 1,000,000 dimensional space, that is also going to lie in the same in this same space. So what we want to see is, if you had the model parameters for some of these known tasks, can you automatically regress the model parameters for unknown tasks? That's the point that we want to try to explore in this particular problem. So you have model parameters of known tasks. What we're going to assume is that you have some pairwise task correlations to work with, right? So we're going to call this gamma that you see here are what we call as pairwise task correlations, and I'll explain that in a moment. You have model parameters of known tasks, tau, theta tau 1 to theta tau m. Gamma are some pairwise task correlations, and we want to predict theta tau j for unknown tasks, for what we call as zero-shot tasks. So this pairwise task correlation, what you see here, we're going to assume is some matrix where somebody gives us some information as to how one task is related to the other. For example, I could say that depth estimation is good for semantic segmentation, right? So they probably correlated. But maybe depth estimation is not correlated with colorization, for instance, right? So I could just come up with some way of correlating these tasks, some approximate ways of correlating. It's completely fine if it's noisy. This doesn't need to be accurate. But this pairwise task correlation is what we're going to record in a matrix and call that matrix as gamma. So now let's move on with this. So there are several ways of getting this. In our work, what we do is to use about 30 people to give us a matrix of how one task could be related to the other, right? So whatever they feel, it doesn't matter. We then aggregate it using some well-known aggregation algorithms to then find out across the 30 people, what does the correlation between the tasks look like, right? So how closely is, say, curvature estimation related to depth estimation, or how is pose estimation related to reshading, things of those kinds, right? So we have considered about 26 tasks and then get the correlation of each of these tasks to other tasks just by asking 30 different people. That's all, very simple, okay? This is the way we go about doing it, but the framework that we come up with can admit any other way of getting the task correlation. These days, there are methods such as task to vec, so on and so forth, where you can get a vector representation for a task. And then you can get a cosine distance between these tasks to be able to use that as a task correlation matrix also. That also works, right? You can take that also as a way of giving this input to our work here. So then we consider a particular work called Taskonomy, which won the Best Paper Award at CVPR 2018. And they, in fact, in their paper propose a method to come up with such a task correlation matrix, right? So their goal is not to do zero-shot task transfer or something like that. They talk about how can you build a task correlation matrix from data, right? So such a task correlation matrix could also be an input to our method, right? So remember their output of their method could be an input to our method. So what we propose is a deep learning architecture called TTNet or Task Transfer Net, where we train what is called a meta learner, which is parameterized by some weights W. So this is the overall architecture where you have multiple heads that are inputs to the network. I think there are a few questions coming in. Maybe I'll take them once I complete a section of this talk here. So you have multiple heads coming in, and each of these are model parameters of different tasks. Remember, this deep neural network here is a network that's going to predict the model parameters. Okay? It's not a neural network that predicts a classification label or a regression output. It actually predicts the model parameters itself. Okay? That's what this neural network does here. So its inputs are model parameters of different tasks. Then you have a bunch of weights here, W1 to Wm. Then you have a set of common weights here, W common. And then the neural network outputs the encoder and decoder parameters that you can use in a model for prediction. Okay, that's why this is called a meta learner or a meta model. Let's see this in a little bit more detail. So the loss function that we use is you have this neural network function f here, which takes as input the parameters of the tasks for which this is e tau 1 to e tau m. Sorry, this should be m here. This is a typo. E tau 1 to e tau m. So those are the parameters of your m tasks. Then these gamma 1i to gamma mi as your task correlations of the first task to the m task to the ith task. Okay, the ith task is what you're trying to predict. Those are the model parameters that you're trying to predict. So those are the inputs to this network, and this network outputs some certain model parameters. In the training phase, you choose these output model parameters to be one of your known models parameters. Just like how in typical supervised learning, you try during training to predict the label of a known data point. Right? So that's what you try to do in traditional supervised learning, because that's how you can get loss. Similarly, we try to predict the model parameters of one of these known tasks and then compute a mean square error between the known model parameters and the predicted model parameters. And that gives us a loss to backpropagate through this network. Right? So that's the first point here. So all these weights here that combine Wn to Wm as well as W common together are what we call as W. And all these gammas, as I just mentioned, are the pairwise task correlations that are given as input, say, through users or as the output of other methods. So now, during training, as I said, what you do is you try to regress a known task, right? You try to regress one of the known tasks because then you can measure the loss and backpropagate through this network. But at test time, what you do is to try to predict the model parameters of an unknown task. Remember, an unknown task is a task for which we don't have any ground truth. We still want to come up with a model and learn a model where there's absolutely no label data at all, right? So that's what we're trying to see. So now what you do is the input to this network. Remember, this network has already been trained according to the previous slide. Now we're talking about inference, right? We're talking about the test time. So you have the same model parameters of your m known tasks as input. Now you give the correlation of these m tasks to the m+1th task. So we're going to tell the neural network that this is how the first task is related to one of these unknown tasks. This is in the second row, we talk about how the second task is related to the unknown task. Similarly, in the third row, we talk about how the third task is related to the unknown task, and so on and so forth. And these correlations are given as input along with the network parameters, and the model now predicts the model parameters of an unknown task. That's the way this architecture works. So in addition to the mean square error loss that I just talked about a couple of slides back, we also include something called a data model consistency loss, where what we do is we take the predicted model parameters for a known task and then use it in a model and see how it performs on that data that we have. Remember for the known tasks, we anyway have labeled data. So we can try to see if we predict a model, how well does it perform on the training data in that particular task, right? So we can get that loss. So that loss is the other term that we have here to help train our meta learner. Right? So we have a lambda parameter that decides what's the coefficient as to how much do you want to weight the first loss and how much do you want to weight the second loss. So that's the overall idea here. And a couple of important details that you need to be able to work with this data is you have to have, remember that you're going to have only one model for each task. Then how do you train a meta learner where you only have one input data point to train, right? So that's going to be the problem here, because if you have m models, m known tasks, you're going to have m models. But then if m is say 10, you have only 10 data points to train this meta learner. That is too little to train a deep neural network model. So what we do now is for the m known tasks, we randomly subsample a few subsets of data, train models. So if you do it p different times, for each of your m tasks, you're going to get p different models. Now this becomes the training data for our meta learner, right? So which means you get p cross m data samples. You have m because you have m different tasks. You have p because for each task, you're going to randomly sample p different times and then train a model, right? So that's how you get p cross m data samples as input, using which we train our meta learner or meta model. So we also introduce one small hack here. In this architecture, we first train each WI individually. So which means you only give the first encoder, train W1, W common, and try to predict the same encoder's output, so on and so forth, right? So you do that for each W1, W2, so on and so forth till WM. And then in another mode called the transfer mode, you then try to train all of them together as part of the single network. So that's what we do with the training here. And at inference, that is at test time, when you actually deploy this model, it runs in transfer mode, which means you give all of these m parameters as input. You give their corresponding correlations to the task for which you want a model, and then the model predicts the model parameters of this unknown task. And once you get the model parameters of the unknown task, just use it to make a prediction, and you know how well the model is performing. So with that, let me show you a few results that we got with this kind of a work. So we take a data set called the Taskonomy dataset, which has about 150,000 images of indoor scenes that have been labeled for 26 different tasks, right? So we need something labeled to be able to study the performance, but we don't use the label information of all of those 26 tasks. So what we do here is we try to train TT nets with different numbers of source tasks. We actually do 4, 6, 10, and 20. So when I say source tasks, those are your labeled tasks. The remaining tasks become unlabeled data or unknown tasks, right? So that's what we try to do. We also have a version where we assume that for the unknown tasks, we have a little amount of labeled data. We also consider that setting, although we evaluate both zero shot and the limited data setting in this particular context. So here are some results, right? In this particular case, the source tasks were autoencoding, scene class, 3D key point, reshading, vanishing point, and colorization. Okay, these were 6 different tasks. And the target task was surface normal estimation. Okay, just to let you know, we had absolutely no label information for surface normal estimation, right? So no label data at all. So what you see here are 2 different examples of the performance. on both these rows, the first image is the image that was given as input. The second image here, GT stands for ground truth. That's the ground truth surface normal estimation. And then all of these other cells are different methods that are applied on the same problem. You can see here that some of these MC, D3D, DD, SkipNet are all different methods here. And TTNet 4, TTNet 6, TTNet 10, and TTNet 20 are actually different versions of a method where we have different number of source tasks, right? So when you see these 6 source tasks here, we are talking about TTNet 6. And if you see the results of TTNet 6, we see that this, in fact, if you go to something like TTNet 20, we actually see that our results are far closer to the ground truth than many of the other methods. What's more interesting here is all of these other methods that we compare ourselves against with are all fully supervised methods, which means they were actually trained with fully labeled data. Okay, we were the only method on each of these rows which was trying to come up with a model with absolutely no labeled data at all, right? And still it performs better than fully supervised models. That's what you see here. Here's another example for depth estimation where we show the same performance, right? So if you notice here, the TTNet 20 and the TTNet LS here gives far better performance on the input image than fully supervised models that give a depth on this particular image here. So, in this case, the zero-shot task was depth estimation. Okay, so one question that you could ask here is, how can you outperform supervised learning? Right? With no labeled data, how can you really outperform supervised learning? I think there's a difficult question to answer here. But the main takeaway is that in our case, we did some study. I'm not going to go into the details here, but we did some study to show that these tasks had some inherent correlations in some latent space, right? And we are simply leveraging the correlations between these tasks to be able to solve a problem with absolutely no labeled data at all. Okay, that's what helps us outperform supervised learning here itself. We did a bunch of different other studies. We showed how you could then do transfer learning from a zero-shot task to a known task using our generated model parameters. Then we tried using different choices of zero-shot tasks to see how it performs. Then we also tried to apply this on different data sets, going to cityscapes, for instance, based on a model that was trained in our setting, and then try to see how it performs on a completely different data set for that matter, right? So all of these worked reasonably well, kind of corroborating what we were trying to do in the first place. If you're further interested, the paper is publicly available. The code is also publicly available if you'd like to try and see how this works. At least that was one of our efforts on trying to do come up with a model and help solve a problem where there's absolutely no label data at all. A second work that I'll probably very briefly talk, I'll try to do this in say 5 to 7 minutes, is called self-supervised manifold mix-up for few-shot learning. So this work was presented at conference WACB last year. It was joint work with collaborators at Adobe. So here, what we were trying to solve is what is called as the few-shot learning problem. Right? In few-shot learning, what you have is, as I already mentioned earlier, you have certain classes for which you have a large number of samples, and then a certain number of classes for which you have very few samples. You still want to come up with a model that can classify any of the classes in your problem setting. Okay, that's what few-shot learning is about. And before we came up with this work, there were many ways of going about few-shot learning. There are what are called as metric learning methods. There are what are called meta-learning methods. Then there are what are called generative methods, so on and so forth. And this is how some of the numbers looked before we came up with our method, right? So you can see some numbers here. Mini ImageNet is a benchmark for few-shot learning. CUB or CUBirds dataset is a benchmark for few-shot learning. CIFAR few-shot is a benchmark for few-shot learning. And these are the kinds of numbers that the methods before us would get on these benchmarks. So don't worry about these numbers. I'll come back to these numbers after a few slides. This is just to say that this was the kind of numbers that earlier methods used to get. The question that we try to ask here is, how important is the backbone for few-shot learning? Right? So most of these few-shot learning methods used a backbone neural network, which was then embellished in different ways to solve the few-shot learning problem. Right? So the question that we try to ask is, how important is that backbone few-shot learning here? So what we try to use in our approach is to do two different things to help improve the backbone. We do what is called self-supervised learning, And the second thing that we do is called manifold mix-up. So I'll try to explain both of these very briefly and then show how it's used in our few-shot learning method. Manifold mix-up is a data augmentation strategy, right? So if you have a data set, mix-up was a method that was proposed a couple of years ago, where you can augment your data by interpolating between data points. If you have a data point with, say, class label A, if you have a data point, say, with class label B, then you can do a linear interpolation of those two data points and come up with a new data point and its corresponding class label, right? So for example, the new class label for this interpolated data point would be 0.5 probability class 1, 0.5 probability class 2, right? So you remember that your class label is a vector, right? It can have a distribution over your class labels. So this is what mix-up does. What manifold mix-up does is do the same thing, but do it in a feature space. Don't do it in the input space. Okay, that's what manifold mix-up does here. So it's a data augmentation strategy. And self-supervised learning is a new paradigm of doing unsupervised learning, where, as the name states, the idea is to get self-supervision from the data itself. That's why it's self-supervision, right? Instead of doing unsupervised learning, can you actually try to do some supervised learning on the data itself? Okay, what can you do if you had, for example, image data? You can probably rotate an input and try to predict the rotation angle. You can perhaps take an image, make it black and white, and ask a neural network to colorize the image. You can take an image, make it into multiple parts, permute it, and ask the neural network to solve the jigsaw puzzle and predict the right permutation. Right? There are so many things you can do without any labels at all. This is what is known as self-supervision. Okay, it's very popular. I mean, this particular blog on top, if you're very interested, I would recommend you to read this blog. This blog is by a person called Lillian Wang. And there's a very nice blog that talks about the different things that you can do with self-supervision, right? So, for example, you can rotate an image and predict the rotation angle, so on and so forth. So how does this help, right? Why does this help? So it gives us a network that has become a bit more aware of the data that you're working with. So tomorrow, if the same data set, a part of it is labeled, the network that I have has already been primed about the distribution of the data by trying to solve these kinds of problems. Now, fine-tuning such a model to a target supervised task has been shown to give better performance than not doing self-supervision at all. Okay, this is what self-supervision is. So what we do in our work is to bring both of the two together in a single framework for few-shot learning. So what we do now is you have certain classes where you have a lot of number of examples, as I already mentioned. That's what few-shot learning does. You take those samples, you take a neural network, which we call as a feature extractor here. You train it using a classification loss for those samples. Remember, for those samples, you do have enough number of labeled data, right? So you can have a classification loss. You can also have an auxiliary self-supervision loss that helps us learn the distribution much better. That's what we do in the first level. Then what we do now is for the new data where there are few samples. Remember, in few-shot learning, there are a few classes for which you're going to have only a few samples. Those are these classes that you have here. Now, for these classes, what you do now is you send it through this feature extractor that was trained in the previous step. Now you use classification loss to just fine-tune that feature extractor, right? So that feature extractor now probably, the hope is that that feature extractor due to self-supervision, it has already learned the data distribution from all of the classes well, even the few-shot classes. When you do the self-supervision part, you can even have the few-shot classes in that particular setting. So now these few-shot classes are sent through that same feature extractor, and using a classification loss, some fine-tuning is done to help improve this network. Then what you do later, at the end, what you have is you take this feature vector of all of the classes, then you just learn a couple of layers just to get a representation, and simply use a cosine classifier to give an output label for your feature vector. And you use manifold mix-up in both these steps here to help get augmentation and help improve the feature extractor. Okay, this is what we do. Very simple. In fact, just to let you know why this is important, why am I presenting this work? earlier methods that did few shot learning were trying to solve a very different convex optimization problem to help and so on and so forth, right? What we try to show is that you can actually achieve this with very simple tricks, and you actually don't need very complicated mathematical procedures to achieve this particular problem. That's what we talked about here. And using this approach, we show that we significantly improve performance. Like the performance improved by 5 to 6 accuracy percentage just by making simple changes in improving the robustness of that feature extractor. Effectively, that's what we end up doing on the previous slide, is to help improve the feature extractor using this kind of a method. Okay, this work is also available on arXiv. The code is publicly available if you'd like to take this and try it out or improve upon it. Okay, hopefully that gave you a perspective of at least what people try to do when they're trying to learn with limited supervision, right? So you probably need to put your work in a given setting and then try to solve your setting using newer methods that you can come up with. And maybe over the next, I'll take 5 to 7 minutes more, maybe just to walk through a few other efforts that we have, and then I'll be happy to go over questions and have any discussions that you may have. So one of the directions that we also work on is active learning. So we do a bunch of different things here, but one of the directions that we also work on is active learning. So in active learning, the main goal is it's the same problem here. The same problem is that it's difficult to label all your data. So what you want to do now is come up with an algorithm which can decide which data points you should label to get the best performance. Right? So if you had 1 million data points, you may not need to label 1 million data points to develop a model. Why is this required? You can now imagine, let's say somebody is doing bioinformatics. Let's say they're doing gene array classification or something like that. To label every data point, you actually need a bioinformatics expert. They may not have the time to label 1 million data points for you. Labeling a cat and a dog, you can probably label 1 million images, maybe because any layman or laywoman can actually label those images. But when you go to something like bioinformatics or any other domain which requires expertise, labeling data and annotating data becomes a significant challenge. What active learning tries to do is to find data points such that even if you selectively label only a few data points, from those few data points, you get almost the same performance as learning from a fully labeled data set. Okay, this is what active learning is about. We actually have a bunch of different efforts in active learning, but I'm just going to talk about one of them here, is where we try to do active learning for object detection. Specifically, we were trying to develop this method in our efforts in agriculture, where we found that one of the projects that we had here was, given a rice paddy farm, we had to count the number of flowering grains in a given image. Right? So apparently, if a patch of land goes to 50% flowering, that's a very important indication to a farmer as to when the harvest can happen. So to do that, you need to count the number of flowers in a rice paddy farm, right? And you can now imagine labeling such data sets, right? You're going to have 200, 300 flowers in a given image of a rice paddy farm, and somebody has to sit and label all these boxes in every image. If you had 1,000 images, they have to label every single bounding box in every image. That's tremendous work for a farmer to sit and do it with you. They may say, I don't want AI at all, right? So then sitting and labeling all of these. That's the problem that we have here. So what we try to do here is to do something called an adaptive supervision strategy for active learning, where apparently it's known that if you have to label a bounding box in an image, where you want to say that in this bounding box area, I have a rice flower or something like that, apparently it takes 35 seconds to label every such bounding box. Whereas if you only point to a bounding box, it only takes 5 to 7 seconds, right? So reduces an effort by 5x. If you had to only point to an area rather than draw the bounding box. So what we come up with is an adaptive active learning strategy, where we only ask the user to point to a particular object, and we draw the bounding box ourselves through an algorithm. And only where we are unsure, we ask the person to label a bounding box around the region. That's what we try to do here. So we adaptively try to say that, don't worry, these parts of the image I can manage, you don't need to label, just label these parts for me, right? So that helps reduce the annotator's burden and thus helps us give data sets that actually work in practice. Okay, that's what we do in this particular work. More recently, we did some work called meta consolidation for continual learning. As I mentioned earlier, continual learning is a setting where you want to continually learn newer and newer tasks, newer and newer classes without catastrophically forgetting the kind of tasks that you may have seen earlier, right? So that's what we want to do with continual learning. So this particular work called meta consolidation, our inspiration came from the way humans would do it, right? So if you go back and say, maybe some of you may have never bicycled in the last few years, right? But if you've learned to bicycle in your childhood, you never forget it, right? So then this is continual learning, right? You learned a task 20 years ago. You've been learning several other things more recently, but you've never forgotten how you learned to do something 20 years ago. So how do we go about it? Is it that we store a model for each of them in our brains? Possibly not, right? Maybe all of this knowledge is stored in some compressed form in our human brain, and whenever we need it, we can decompress it and use it, right? So that's what maybe the human brain is doing. And that's the kind of approach that we proposed in this particular work. We use the variational autoencoder to have a latent space where we store all of this task knowledge. And whenever a task comes, we decompress it from that latent space, generate model parameters, and then make the predictions for that particular task. So we use a variational autoencoder to do this step called meta consolidation for continual learning. About 3 years ago, we also did some work on adversarial data programming, where we talked about generating labeled data sets to solve a problem, given some kind of labeling functions. Now imagine you want to create a data set. Let's say you want to help with COVID, right? You go to a hospital and ask them, can you give me chest x-rays? I'll try to come up with an algorithm that can look at chest x-rays and predict what's the possibility of COVID coming up soon or something like that. Let's say you want to do it, right? You go to the radiologist that you know, and the radiologist is telling me I'm already overburdened. I can't sit and label 10,000 images for you. I can't do it, right? But what the radiologist can do for you is to give you some labeling rules. They can tell you that if I see a lump in the left top of the chest x-ray, if I see some kind of a texture in the bottom right of the chest x-ray, I think there could be a higher risk. A rule such as this, a radiologist can give you. Now, how can you automatically generate labeled data sets based on such weak labeling rules is what data programming and adversarial data programming is about. Okay, that's what we do in one of our other efforts. Data programming is a very popular strategy that people use in the industry whenever you have this issue of going from weak labeling rules to labeled data. We've also done some work on zero-shot domain generalization. I think I already introduced it earlier. Domain generalization is where you learn a model from a few domains, and then you want to predict the model on a completely unseen domain. Right? So that's what we try to do in this particular task. We actually have several papers in zero-shot learning where we try to solve a problem where you have, for a few classes, lots of data, but for a few classes called zero-shot classes, absolutely no data at all. Right? So we try to do it using bidirectional alignment and so on and so forth. We have a few different methods in this direction. We've also been looking at synthetic data generation. In this particular example, where we were looking at autonomous navigation, we wanted to, if you have data only that has been captured in the daytime, then trying to run the model in, say, foggy weather is not going to work, right? So in fact, this is an example of NVIDIA's autonomous navigation model called PilotNet, where it was trained on daylight images. You can see that it predicts a steering angle of minus 78 degrees on this image, which is correct because there's a sharp left turn here. But when the same image becomes foggy, the steering angle predicted is minus 16 degrees. If this model is deployed in a self-driving car, the car will go straight and run over the mountain and cause an accident, right? So what we try to do here is to be able to test such models using generations, synthetic generations, like foggy generations of an image, rainy generations of an image, nighttime generations of an image, which can help us make our models be learned on this kind of data also and be prepared for these kinds of weather conditions when you do autonomous navigation. Other ongoing efforts that we have is, can we solve supervised learning tasks from no label data at all? How far can we stretch this? What is the capacity of a neural network? How long can it continue to learn in a continual learning setting before you say that I cannot do anything more, I have to learn from scratch all over again, right? Then how can you do domain adaptation, but with label space misalignments? So you have a model for autonomous navigation that was trained on cityscapes, which is a German data set. And then you want this model now to work on an Indian setting where you may have an auto rickshaw, where you have a buffalo on the road. These are class labels that you don't see in the German data set at all, right? But then how do you still continue to do domain adaptation when you have label space misalignments are some of the example problems that we are trying to tackle at this point in time. Just to summarize and conclude, learning with no to limited supervision is actually a very, very important problem and perhaps the next big challenge confronting us, especially if we assume that supervised learning is something that we have done now, right? We know that it's not like it's easy to do, but with some engineering, we know how to get it to work on different problems, right? If you have enough label data. But now we are trying to see how do you solve the next few years, how do you solve these problems even when you don't have limited data? So you have a plethora of settings here: zero-shot learning, one-shot learning, few-shot learning, meta-learning, continual learning, active learning, data programming, transfer learning, so on and so forth. And I personally think this is very important, especially for machine learning to percolate to applications starved of labels, right? Once again, remember that large companies are going to create public data sets only where they have commercial interest. They're not going to create a data set for a rural public health problem in India because they don't have a market there, right? They're never going to create a data set, right? So that kind of a data set has to be created by somebody who's doing research there, or a public health worker, or an NGO, or somebody from that village, right? So if you really want machine learning to have an impact in those kinds of settings, solving these problems becomes inevitable as a next set of challenges for machine learning researchers. I think I'll stop here. I'll be happy to take questions. I'm sorry to probably go over time here, but hopefully this was of some use to who attended this talk. Thank you for your time and the invite again. Let me try to look at the chat and see if there are questions there. I'll be happy to go over them, but if any of you want to speak,
Sir, Dhruva
please feel free.
Sir, Dhruva will read out to you. Is that okay?
That would be great. That would be definitely helpful.
Sure, sure. Dhruva, you can read out the queries of the participants.
Yes, sure, sir. So there are a few queries.
Sure. Please.
So there's a question: how to increase the efficiency of model when we have data which have multiple segmentation available on the specific image patch?
I couldn't really
Questions from
get,
Pankaj Shah. Okay, I'll repeat.
not the repeat. I couldn't. I'm actually looking at the question also. I couldn't clearly get what it means by
Yeah.
multiple segmentation available on a specific image patch. I didn't understand what that meant. Maybe if Pankti can clarify, that would greatly help.
Yes, am I audible?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Project on prostate cancer detection. In that there were several images which were original images, but then afterwards annotations for different stages was available on page. Like it had multiple so I was not able to gain much good accuracy. So that sort of
But what do you mean by multiple segmentation variables? I mean, does it mean that a pixel belongs to different classes? Is that what you mean?
yes, sir.
I'm not sure how that is possible. Generally, when you do annotation on semantic segmentation, every pixel has to belong to a particular label. That's what the annotation task does in semantic segmentation.
All right.
So I couldn't clearly get what you meant by multiple segmentations on a given image patch.
For instance, consider it has multiple annotation, like it has a pattern of like consider Gleason score 4 and a Gleason score 3 in a single image. So that sort of data was available, and I was supposed to justify and predict, but I was not able to gain much accuracy more than 70%. So My
No,
question
it had, I still couldn't get that. It has multiple what? Multiple what on a given image?
unknown. All right, sir. It was, see, I was working on prostate cancer, so there
So
is a
that is
string
fine.
for.
I think multiple what? I mean, are you saying that I didn't understand what multiple annotations means?
All right. May I explain, or I'm proceeding time?
Pankti, what you can
Maybe
do is
let's
you can probably mail Vinith sir later. Sir, will that be
sure.
okay?
That's completely fine. Yeah, maybe you can send an
Okay,
email.
sir. Thank you.
It'll help me get the context a bit. Maybe
Sure.
in the interest of time, maybe we can go on to the next question if it's okay.
Right. Dhruva, you may continue with the next question.
Okay, sir. So, okay, there's a question. Performing the same task on different spectral images, can it be treated as zero-shot task transfer problem?
Zero shot
Question.
typically, sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Zero shot typically means that you don't have any labels for some of the classes, right? So, okay, I think I get the question. Yes, very much. I mean, if you're saying that for certain spectral images, you have the labels, for the other ones, you don't, it absolutely can be treated as a zero shot task transfer problem, right? Very much, right? I would, in fact, say if you're working on this problem, you can probably take our code and try it, right? So, it may work. Right? So, definitely, yes, you can consider it that way.
Okay, sir. And the next question is, for efficient meta learning in the current context, how does the number of known tasks affect?
Sure. So in our work, as I mentioned, I didn't get a chance to go too much into the depth there, is we were trying it with known task, 4 known tasks, 6 known tasks, 10 known tasks, 20 known tasks, so on and so forth. We found that somewhere around once we hit the 6 known tasks, the performance is quite good. Right? 4 known tasks was too less. Obviously, 20 known tasks performed the best, but we found that the moment you start hitting 6 known tasks, things started performing quite well, right? So I think it also depends on the domain that you're in. To some extent, maybe the data set that we were in, the kind of task that we were looking at, that's how much information that we needed to solve the problem. Maybe it could be different in a different domain, but at least in our case, somewhere around 6 tasks is where we started hitting good performance.
Sir, the next question is, how can limited samples be dealt with hyperspectral sensor agricultural land data?
Sure. Yeah. So this one, I think the first thing is it depends that's what I was trying to say in the very beginning, that there are many shades, there are many layers in the cake, right? So the moment you see limited samples, the first question to ask is, what does limited samples mean? Does it mean that the overall data set is small? Does it mean that you have imbalanced data? Does it mean some classes you have a lot of data, but for some classes you don't have any data? Or for some classes you have little data? Or does it mean that for maybe you have a lot of unlabeled data but limited labeled data? I think each of these leads to a different setting, right? I hope you got that. One of that would become few shot learning, one of that would become semi-supervised learning. Say one of that could become, in fact, I probably didn't talk about it. There's also a setting of what is called long tail recognition, where you have a data set where the class distribution is a long tail distribution, right? So where for some classes you have many samples, for some classes you have only a few samples. There are a very subtle difference between long tail recognition and few shot learning, but both of these are somewhat similar. So depending on what is the actual constraint that you're facing in your problem space, you have to pick the setting and pick the method in that setting to solve your problem, right? So it's difficult to give a generic answer. It depends on what is the specific problem with limited samples that you're facing in your setting. I think there are enough methods to address it today. You just have to pick the right family of methods.
Okay, sir. Thank you. And sir, Darshil has a forecasting and rearrangement of grid utility smart system with alarm technology, and he's facing trouble in arrangement of data in the Excel sheet. So how can he do with the regression analysis?
Could you please
That's
repeat
the
this question?
Yes, sir, sure. Sir, he has said that he has developed a ML-based data forecasting and rearrangement of grid utility smart system with alarm technology. But he's facing trouble in arrangement of my data in the Excel sheet. So how can he do with the regression analysis?
I couldn't clearly get what it means by facing trouble in arrangement of my data in Excel sheet. I couldn't clearly get what that means.
I'll just repost his question, sir, if you want.
I think I got the question. I mean, it's more, I'm trying to understand. I mean, you have to format your data. Without that, you cannot do any machine learning. So, I mean, it's not necessary that you have to always use an Excel sheet. Even text data is fine, depending on what platform you're using. If you're using, say, scikit-learn, PyTorch, whatever it is, many of them can import data of different formats. So if you can format your data in some way in which one of these platforms can take it in, I think that should be fine. You should be able to use any machine learning methods. I couldn't clearly get beyond that as to what the data, but I assume it's something to do with formatting of data. That's what I understood from the question. If
Yes.
that be the case, you probably, I mean, I cannot speak much. It depends on what the data is. You probably need to go deeper into your data and try to format it better to be able to use. You can use one of the known formats, CSV files, TXT files, space delimited files, and then try to go from there and use it with any existing machine learning frameworks.
Okay, sir. And sir, this Darshita has asked that can we use TDNet for RL setup where we want an agent to learn two different tasks during an training, then test it on a task which is a composition of the above two tasks?
You can, very much, yeah. We didn't try that, but you very much can, right? So I think it's you just have to find a way of, especially if you're doing a composition of the two tasks, for you it's very easy because the correlation is straightforward. You know how that relates to the two tasks. It's probably far easier there, but yes, yeah, you can definitely use our method there.
That's it for the question and answer session, I guess, sir.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for coordinating this.
Thank you, sir. This was a really fruitful and informative session. Now, I would like to call upon Dr. M.V. Rajesh, Chair of SPS Kerala chapter, to present the vote of thanks.
Good morning, one and all. Guest of honor for today's joint event, Dr. Vineet, the chairman of Gujarat section, Chirag, Dr. Chirag, Dhruva, Arpan and Riti from Gujarat section and other volunteers, my colleagues from Kerala section and attendees. Hope all of you are keeping safe at your residences. And it was a very surprisingly pleasant experience that the Gujarat section and Kerala section could jointly organize such a program with nearly 100 attendees throughout. So I would like to first of all thank the entire volunteers of Gujarat section under the leadership of Dr. Chirag to conceive this great idea of working together amid the pandemic, and we proved that it is very much possible. So we do feel like a pan-India feeling when we sit together to discuss a very tough, generally tough topic of digital signal processing and data analytics with Dr. Vineet. I would like to congratulate my colleagues from Kerala also for attending this wonderful event. I would like to, as part of the proceedings, place on record our sincere gratitude from the entire IEEE fraternity to Dr. Vineet for sparing his valuable time with us. And it was a very useful talk. I do understand that many PG and research students are currently attending this. They might have got 1 or 2, 3 points out of this, and further they could develop and work more and more on this, where you can further, definitely, some of the discussions were not complete. I think this networking is forever, and we can keep in touch with Dr. Vineet in future also. As a token of our collective appreciation for spending your time, we would like to present a memento that also virtually now to Dr. Vineet.
Thank you. Yeah,
I
thank you.
request you to kindly accept this from the IEEE family.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for all your kind gestures. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I would like to thank Dr. Chirag and all other hosting volunteers and attendees from Gujarat section for making this joint event a grand success. And we will continue this practice in future courses also. I do understand because I am new as the chairman of Kerala session. From the time of Dr. Suresh itself, we have a special connection with Gujarat, the extreme end of the country to that middle place. So that looking very, I mean, interesting as well. So I would like to thank Dr. Chirag for organizing and leading this event. Thank you, Dr. Chirag. And also I would like to thank
Thank you.
Dhruva, Riti, and Arpan, all of them working in the background to make arrange this virtual platform and inviting, generating the registration link and so many other back the curtain activities there. Thank you each and every volunteer of IEEE. Last but not the least, all the participants. So it is very difficult because DSP is little notorious across all campuses, being treated as a very tough subject. With the activities of SPS, I think we have could achieve something like demystifying DSP across the country or globally also because of the SPS activities. And that is the reason why we, even though people are now sleeping over webinars, we have got 95 plus participants for this program. That shows the interest in people and the visibility improvement that we could do through the SPS activities. Therefore, with due respect, I would like to thank every participant of this joint program. Thank you very much from the bottom of our heart, from the entire SPS, all Indians from Kerala and Gujarat. Thank you, participants. I am looking forward for more and more, I mean, collective and collaborative activities in future as well. With these few words, I would like to proudly announce that this was a great experience, amazingly good experience, and we will definitely continue in the collaboration with Gujarat section, and would like to offer any possible assistance from Kerala section, and expecting the same kind of cooperation in all future activities there from Gujarat as well. So please keep safe. Be very disciplined on health issues related to COVID, and hope that we will be meeting soon with another program. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Actually, I would like to ask everyone to switch on the cameras so that you can take a group photo.
I request the participants to please visit the feedback form which is available in the chat window and kindly help us improving our activities further with your opinions over there. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Vineet, sir.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for having
Thank
me.
you, Chirag,
Thank you,
Arpan,
Vineet, sir.
everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Raj.
Thank you, sir, for sharing your valuable knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you, Vinay.